Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Kanitra Tyler. She is the Supply Chain Risk Management Service Element Lead at NASA. Ms. Tyler, good to have you with us.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I guess from NASA standpoint, it could be any time of the day or night, anywhere in the world. So being a global operation there and beyond. And the whole idea of communications and SCRM and all of these issues that you deal with. First of all, tell us exactly what your job is. What do you mean by the service element lead for supply chain risk management?
Certainly. So NASA, over the past, I'd say 3 years, has gone through what was called a MAP, Mission Architecture Support Program, which was essentially a transformative activity for the entire agency where, in this case, the Office of the CIO of course, we have 11 different NASA centers geographically dispersed, and each center, of course, operates differently. They all have a different mission. However, the problem came in that things like cybersecurity was also being inconsistently applied depending on which center you went to. So now supply chain risk management, like other cybersecurity services, are delivered from an enterprise perspective. Those things that are intended to enable the mission, and supply chain risk management, or what we'll say is information and communications technology or cyber supply chain risk management, is just one of those elements. And I caveat that because ICT or SCRM is only one of the aspects of supply chain at NASA. As an example, we have supply chain risk management activities that happen within our Office of Safety and Mission Assurance, which hence the name, they are focused on safety, human safety and things of that nature, whereas supply chain is performing assessments of risk. Safety and mission assurance, they are actually performing audits and looking at things from a financial perspective.
Let's talk about information and communications technology. It's pretty much basic to every single thing that happens at NASA, correct? And maybe give us a sense of the scope of these assets and resources.
So for the service, it is an enterprise-wide service. It covers the entire life cycle of what we would normally refer to as a system. So that system being something that is providing a service or delivering some function or capability for the enterprise. So it's from the design, the development, how we distribute it, how we deploy it, how we acquire it. And that acquisition piece is definitely a huge part of what we're doing in protecting our assets. And then also that maintenance and destruction. So we're looking at all of those threats and vulnerabilities that may be intentionally or unintentionally introduced that would compromise any of that IT or OT, for that matter, at any stage of that.
And does the information and communications technology include the intercommunications of business information and the normal business of the various centers communicating with one another? But does it also include, say, satellite communications and the downlinks in that part of the comms?
So it is everything that falls within the definition of a covered article. So in that context, it's the information technology as defined in section 11-101 of Title 40. That also includes cloud computing. So the telecommunications equipment, the telecommunications service, anything that is subject to the Controlled Unclassified Information Program, all of that encompasses what we are focused on from an ICT or a cyber SCRM perspective.
And let's talk about for a moment the thing that you said is foundational to protecting all of these elements, and that is the acquisition piece. That is to say, from the outset of even before you own it, security and cybersecurity are concerns. And so what happens at the acquisition stage, or what should happen ideally to begin on a good foot, that is to, with what it is you're buying and eventually deploying?
So we have two things. I'll start with, I guess, the easier one, which is that commercial IT acquisition process. We have another team also within the Office of the CIO, that is the IT Acquisition Management, ITAM, or Commercial IT Request, SITR team. As part of that SITR process, from a customer perspective, the customer identifies that thing that they need. The SITR process goes off and does all of those checks that are required in order to authorize an IT or OT acquisition. Supply chain is just one of those elements that they perform that check on. Section 508 is another example of that check that is performed. Once the customer has entered into that SITR process, they basically sit back and wait for their authorization number and that complete procurement package to be returned to them. At which point, if they are a credit card holder, they can go off and do their acquisition via that purchase card. If it is above the simplified acquisition or that P card, as we call it, the purchase card threshold, then they would actually go into SAP, which is our acquisition system. On the other hand, if it's not a commercial IT acquisition, rather it's a contract that's being put in place, the NASA FAR supplement is what we have, and what we have is called a procurement class deviation, PCD. PCD 15-03 in its current form is at letter D, basically requires that contract clauses be put in such that that offerer or that potential offerer identifies for us all. While the legislation says moderate and high, NASA has taken the path of, we are going to look at all covered articles as well as open source, regardless of that FIPS 199 categorization. So as part of that process, that offerer would indicate to us all of those covered articles that they are going to use in performance of that contract. And this is including their corporate assets, if that corporate asset is going to process any of that non-public NASA information. If, however, that corporate asset is just that, is their corporate asset, say, for example, their time and attendance system, that is not something that we would ask for them to share. But again, anything that is touching that non-public NASA information or is actually being used, so that laptop or that server or that software that's being used to develop whatever it is that you have been contracted to do is what we ask them to report back to us. Our policy states that no contract shall be awarded until after that submission has happened from the offerer, and that we in the Office of the CIO have given the okay to actually have that offerer come in and begin to perform. We are right now strategically pausing on updating that procurement class deviation, in that we are waiting with bated breath for those federal acquisition regulation, the FAR updates that will capture some of the newer cybersecurity as well as supply chain requirements. And the great news is we're told that those requirements will be in one place, as opposed to the way that it is now, kind of sporadically placed around the FAR, and it's kind of, go hunt for what you need to do.
Right. I think that's going to be FAR part 50 something that they'll be
Yeah.
adding if they ever consolidate all of that. And it sounds like you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. That is to say, for equipment that and services that NASA will buy, then you are assured of some degree of protection and security before you buy it. But also for suppliers that handle NASA data in the course of the services they deliver, which
Yes.
maybe the data then would be outside of NASA, maybe coming back at some point, but you have this issue of contractors holding government information.
Correct. And that's why I said any device that they are using, whether it is on NASA premises or on their corporate premise, they would, and it is processing, transmitting, or storing non-public NASA information, they are required to report all of those components to us.
And do you have any methods for verifying what they say, or do you do spot checks, for example?
So we in the Office of the CIO do not, but part of what we are working through as an enterprise through two separate groups. One is the Supply Chain Security Working Group, which is chaired by me and supports the Principal Advisor for Enterprise Protection and was chartered by the Deputy Administrator, Bob Cabana. The second group is the Supply Chain Resiliency Board, which is chartered by our Associate Administrator for Space System Studies. So one of the things that you can see a theme here is supply chain is high on the radar for NASA. And that said, so no, we in Office of CIO will not do that on-site inspection. Rather, our partners in the Office of Safety and Mission Assurance, they will as part of their audit. We do more of how we verify is through some of the platform tools that we are using, one being Interos Resilience, formerly known as Scrimmage, and the other being BitSight. And then, of course, a lot of open source research that we're performing. And then, there is the thing of we want to build partnerships with our suppliers. So we would hope that they are being honest and we never have to play the, False Claims Act card. That's never a fun thing. So again, I feel like supply chain, cybersecurity, all of these things are about having those relationships in place where we are going to be honest, even when the truth hurts.
Yes, because when it comes to, say, buying a piece of equipment, a piece of hardware for communications and information processing, the supply chain that goes into that thing that is delivered and all of the components inside of it, you've got a really big supply chain and probably a worldwide supply chain. And so I guess maybe the challenge then is your assurance that the contractor is assured of its own supply chain, that it knows how far out into the hinterlands that reaches and may not be coming with parts from sanctioned countries, for example.
Yeah, so what we have in place, we have two separate processes. One is the CAT scan, the covered article and technology supply chain assessment needed. That is a very reactive process. The other is the proactive supplier engagement process, which hence the name is that proactive engagement. We're reaching out to the suppliers, again, starting that building of that relationship, asking them very specific questions, specifically focused around, how are you, what is your supply chain risk management program? Or they may call it global resilience. There are a lot of different names for it, but we want them to tell us how they are protecting their supply chains. Who are their suppliers? Do they know, down to, that fourth tier, that fifth tier, to what tier are you aware and knowledgeable of who is in your supply chain and where your components, parts, pieces, and components are coming from to formulate that final product.
And I guess let's say the potential for a cyber risk can go 2 or 3 layers down from that prime.
Yes.
I mean, maybe not the paint that's on the box, or even the passive circuit board, but every component on that circuit board, at least the active components,
Yep.
have that potential to be a cybersecurity concern.
Absolutely.
And those could be sourced from anywhere in the world these days. So that's kind of where that concern heads.
Yes.
What are the risks in this day and age right now that you are most concerned about? Let's look at this from that level. I mean, the risk profiles change over time.
So definitely, those foreign adversaries and the I think it's not just the foreign adversaries, but it's more of where there is that foreign ownership, investments, and control, specifically from a software perspective. If you are the publishing software in one of those countries that requires you to basically share your intellectual property, share your customer information, or just share whatever they ask for, that is top of mind, definitely, in understanding, where those foreign interests lie and where there may be a little more foreign buy-in and foreign contribution to what we are receiving, which is going to really stress the importance of having, it's the executive order really focuses in in on those software bills of materials, but we definitely need to have what is now in a DoD environment being referred to as the XBOM. We need to know every part, piece, and component, whether it's hardware, software, firmware. We need to know everything down to the paint on the box.
I want to ask you about the distinction between systems that might be in a rack, that is not the country of Iraq, but in a 19-inch rack-mounted system or something, or a box, versus those systems which are embedded. And they might be embedded in a platform which is flying, or it might be embedded in a platform which is going into space. Those tend to have very long life cycles. And do you have particular concerns about embedded systems, both from a cyber standpoint and from a future support standpoint, because a lack of future support could end the mission or make a continuance of something just as difficult as a cyber concern?
So I think the primary concern with those embedded systems is knowing that it's there, knowing that that component actually exists, which again drives the importance of having that bill of materials. Again, whether it's software, hardware, firmware, knowing what's in there, knowing who provided it, which goes directly to that third P of NASA's three Ps of ICT SCRM, that position, the resilience. We need to know that the entity that provided that component, whether it was the final piece or whether it was that smallest micro component, but that is one of the primary drivers for that particular that final product. So again, having an understanding of what's in the product, that full BOM, and then knowing who provided you with that product and maintaining that relationship, knowing that that particular entity will be there, or understanding when you may need to accept the risk of going to get it from Bob in his garage because, he saw the writing on the wall. Oh, they're going to need this later on. And he just bought up a whole bunch of them and he's selling them on eBay out of his garage. So we just need to, again, understand what's in there, understand where it came from, understand how you're going to do a break fix when needed.
Sure. And you mentioned the BOM, the bill of materials, and I wanted to follow back on a question you've mentioned about software bills of material. This is a big thing now for the federal government to kind of in a learning curve on how to ingest and deal with and analyze software bills of materials. What's NASA's approach? How are you going about that? And do you feel you have some maturity in-house in dealing with SBOMs now?
Within the office of the CIO or within Kanitra's mind and our ICT cyber SCRM team, no, we don't have a broad range of expertise. What we are currently doing is participating in the CISA-sponsored ICT SCRM task force. So Alan Friedman, which I'm just going to say the godfather of SBOM, we attend a lot of webinars with him. We participate in things like the Software and Supply Chain Assurance Forum that NIST hosts. And we're just kind of following CISA's lead on things like that attestation letter, what should be in the SBOM, that minimum criteria, making sure that it's machine readable, understanding the various formats like VEX and things of that nature. We're also, I'm actually one of the co-chairs of the HBOM working group that's part of that same task force. So again, just keeping our eye on and our finger on the pulse of what's happening at the federal level. One of the things that I try to stress at NASA is let us not do what we've done so many times before, is NASA-rize things. Let's stay as closely in lockstep with things that are happening at a higher level. That way, our suppliers, our partners understand and know what to expect, as well as we understand and know what to expect, and understanding there will be, deviations and caveats depending on the criticality of whatever it is that we are attempting to deploy that hardware or software on. But again, staying at that consistency level at the federal level, I think will serve us much better than NASA-rising and being unique.
Yeah, because one of the other difficulties of the SBOM, I'm imagining, is it also exists in time. because software gets updated, software gets totally overhauled. The vendor says, here's a whole new version, which means the SBOM you had last week is totally out of date.
Well, and part of that process that CISA is leading is to make sure that anytime that software changes, then so you're producing a new SBOM, or one would think, hey, as you deliver those updates, you also have that SBOM attached to it in that machine readable format.
And earlier you mentioned operational technology, and I wanted to get a handle on what that means in the NASA context, because often it gets the rap. People think of municipal water systems or something like that, where the software, might have been based on relays from 1940 or something. But I think in your sense, operational technology, something much different.
Yeah, that OT could be something like a star tracker or a GPS receiver. It's also in the NASA context that smart vending machine that is part of OT for us.
Yeah. So how do you how do you deal with that? I mean, probably somewhat differently for the vending machine than for although maybe the vending machine could tell enemy hacker that's people there working overnight. I wonder what's going on.
So pretty much it's all dealt with in the same manner. Again, understanding that there are some things that you won't be able to do to OT that you could do with your native or the historical IT environment. But we treat it the same. We understand what the vulnerabilities are, what that exposure is, what our risk exposure is, and then try to mitigate as much as possible. In that layered fashion, and where we can't mitigate, you start turning things off, and that is one of the things that we highly stress to our customers when they say, oh, well, we're going to purchase this device, but we're only going to use this particular 2 of the 10 capabilities, and we have to tell them, well, sorry, but it's not about what you are going to use the device for. It's about what the device is capable of doing. So again, whether it's IT, OT, we take the same look at it, but again, understanding the variations and what we would be able to do to mitigate any of those vulnerabilities.
All right. So getting back to the words, supply chain risk management, the chief among them might be cybersecurity, but also continuity of supply assurance for keeping things going. It's kind of a COOP issue. What are some of the other supply chain risks? What do you incorporate into the system?
So we are looking at definitely the suppliers of our suppliers, those counterfeit products. That is, we've seen that several times. The risk that our vendors are having, and then so I mentioned the counterfeit, but vendor risk again. I think that is the biggest or the one that is always top of mind for me. And again, goes back to that opening theme of you have to have that relationship. If you don't have that relationship, if you don't have that bidirectional communication, the vendor risk is it, no matter what you do to mitigate, no matter what you do, what controls you put in place, if you don't have that bidirectional communication, all of those controls are for naught. And that's my former deputy CISO hat that I'm putting on putting on there.
Because suppliers may often have a commercial business side
Correct.
to them, and they could, suppose they got into trouble on the commercial side for some sanction violation or something like that. Does that spill over to what you're doing with them on the government side necessarily, or does it depend on the circumstance?
I think it depends on the circumstance. It also depends on the size of that particular entity. Of course, the smaller they are, the least separation you're going to have in those systems as they are supporting, whether it's commercial, whether it's government, whether it's academia. Not every organization is going to have those various zones, if you will, to perform that business.
And there must be some cooperation maybe with the Defense Department, I would think, because in many of the NASA applications, even though NASA's not military, you still have almost mil-spec style requirements because of the nature of the mission. Is there some cross trading of information and approaches there?
So up until recently, we felt like we were the ugly ducklings in the federal government because we are the non-Title 50. happy to say we've been making great strides. We have a memorandum of agreement that's circulating through NASA for signature with the Joint Federated Assurance Center to basically start sharing some of those assessments where, and these are the DoD terms, where there are mutual equities between DoD and NASA. And what that means is, that same product or that same component is used by both entities, both DoD, whether it's Navy and NASA or Army and NASA. So we had a perfect example where they said Navy uses a particular engine for submarines, whereas of course NASA is using that exact same engine from that exact same manufacturer for our shuttles. So that is where we have identified those mutual equities. So I think we are starting to make great strides in being able to cross over to one, share information between those Title 50 and the non-Title 50 entities, as well as those mitigations. Again, I think Executive Order 14028 said it very clear. This is a national issue. It's not a DoD issue. It's not a non-DoD issue. It is a national issue. So we have to start working together as a nation to address it and come up with, one, identify what those vulnerabilities and threats are, and then also document how we, from a national perspective, will start to come together to mitigate.
And let's look at it from a contractor standpoint. Suppose someone would like to do business with NASA and they are in this whole ICT area, information technology, communications technology. What are they going to face as the portal to acquisition at NASA from the outset? What does it look like from the outside?
Sir, I wish I could give you an intelligent answer, but I cannot. I do not at all try to navigate the acquisition swim lane. I leave that to my friends in the Office of Procurement, and then my friends that are in the Office of the CIO's Enterprise Business Management Office. And to that end, we have a working relationship, and we actually have what's called a liaison in the Office of Procurement. So what we say is OCIO, so for supply chain, the language that goes into the provision and the clause for supply chain, that is the language that I architect. However, the Office of Procurement, they are the actual implementers. So the contracting officers are the ones who put the provisions and the clauses into the contracts. They are the ones that collect it from those offerers or those external entities. But sir, that is the extent of my involvement with the actual. I'm just going to say I am a piece or I'm a cog in the acquisition wheel.
Sure. Understood. Yeah, that's okay. But I guess I'd put it this way or ask you this way, then there are certain things that you need to make sure that the 1102s are dealing with such that the requirements of your program get satisfied. So what is it that you download, hopefully that the 1102s will inculcate into their activities such that the ICT SCRM program gets what it needs ultimately?
Right. Okay. So one of the, I mentioned earlier that procurement class deviation and that the offerer needs to submit everything that they're using in performance of that contract. So we've actually put together a template that is a subset of the questions that's in our information sharing questionnaire. And note that I am very careful to say it is information sharing. We are not collecting data. We are not data gathering. We are not doing anything that will require that Paperwork Reduction Act authorization. The supplier can very well say, no, we're not going to do this as part of that proactive supplier engagement process. This, however, again, is one of those contractual requirements. And again, it is just them meeting their obligation. So they're providing things that would just be their firmographics, if you will. Where is your corporate headquarters? Of course, one of the primary things, what is your actual entity name? Do you also do business as other entities? How can we find you in your unique entity ID and things of that nature. But more importantly, we want them to identify all of their subsidiaries, not just you're doing business as, but we want to understand all of the subsidiaries, those key management officials, all of their operating facilities. And then again, at least down to tier 3, we want to know who are all of the suppliers, and then who are they distributing those products to. And then finally, if they are offering those commercial products, tell us all of those products that you, from your corporate perspective, intend for NASA to acquire. And I say that because we have had instances where a customer will submit the entire Microsoft software catalog. And we all know that, Microsoft produces for government, for home use, for business use, for academic use. So we want a Microsoft to tell us, okay, this is everything we intend for NASA to acquire or to have in your operational environment. We recently had Samsung come back and say, hey, yeah, this device that you all are asking about, it's really more of a consumer level. We do offer, something for government or public sector use. And that's the type of information that we want shared back with us.
And on the reverse end, you must evaluate the performance of gear and of services over time, because there's an assurance over time, as we've discussed. How do you maintain a supplier rating system, even though, again, that's officially someone else's ownership, but you must feed back into that because of your experience in the operational end of things?
So right now, we are, and again, this is just from an Office of the CIO perspective, we have the Archer platform, and we are using that as, I'd like to say, kind of the hub to gather all of that ICT or SCRM information that would feed in from our 2 platforms, that being Interos Resilience and BitSight. So both of those have scoring and alert capabilities built into them. One of the things that's on our roadmap over the next 6 to 12 months, we're actually going to start taking a harder look at where the suppliers that we currently subscribe to sit. Are they tier 1? Are they tier 2? Are they tier 3? And then assign some criticality. That way, we are really saying, oh, if this particular entity falls below this particular score, we want to get an immediate alert. Or we can also have things happen like, oh, the system will automatically send an email to that particular supplier, and they'll circle back with us. Now, understand that is not being done for all of our suppliers, simply because we are not financially able to do it for all of our suppliers. And so in comes a homegrown or one of those government off-the-shelf systems that our Office of Safety and Mission Assurance has developed and cultivated and evolved over time, which is Supply Chain Insight Central. There is where that will eventually become the agency's SCRM repository, and all of those entities, such as OCIO, such as the Office of Protective Services, would feed that information into that data repository. And then as an enterprise, and again, that's where those 2, the Supply Chain Security Working Group and that Supply Chain Resiliency Board, are going to have to start developing that criteria and our own internal scoring system. What is important to us? When do we want to be alerted when something changes within that supplier state, regardless of if it's a cyber issue or if it's a safety issue? And so that is something that we're working on as an agency. Again, it's making sure we are bringing the entire village in and everyone is playing their part for the betterment of the overall community.
And that word of safety that you mentioned brings to mind the question that you must have a risk management approach to this, because not every supplier you don't have the resources for the same energy and scrutiny of every supplier. So maybe once you've determined that a connector, is legitimate and not counterfeit, it may not need as much further attention as the large platform full of electronics that it's connected to.
Absolutely. And again, that goes back to being able to not only tier the suppliers that are in your ecosystem, but also assign criticality to them. And one of the things that we've started in that criticality assessment, of course, following some of the guidance that's in this special publication 800-161, but starting off with what are those mission essential functions? We already track it from a COOP perspective. We already report on it quarterly. So then the next question is those information systems, what are those functions that they are delivering? What tools and or services are used to facilitate the delivery of those critical functions, and then who are the suppliers, and track it that way. So that again, that's just a work in progress from an enterprise perspective, not just for the office of the CIO.
Tell us about the human capital aspects of your job. I mean, you run an office and a service with people involved. And I imagine the requirements for human capital knowledge and training and skills must be evolving over time also.
Absolutely, and we are learning together. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I have assigned one of my team members. So my team consists of myself, the one civil servant, and I have 11 support contractors. And one of the tasks is to basically develop a cyber SCRM incident response plan. And the first thing is, what is the definition of a CSCRM incident? Not to be confused with your basic, IT or OT cyber incident. It's not the same. So that is one of the things. And actually, you participated in a pilot with CISA, where that is a question that's on the table across government. How are we going to define a CSCRM or an ICT SCRM incident? Again, not to be confused with what we know historically as just a cyber incident. So definitely the human capital piece, and I think that's one of the things that maybe supply chain is a little better than just cybersecurity, because things are always evolving, things are changing, and the threat landscape is, I think, a little broader from a supply chain perspective than it is just basic cyber.
And people that are manufacturing aircraft or people that are working with NASA to develop whatever platforms NASA is undergoing have similar issues with their supply chains and similar legal and statutory, as well as just corporate governance requirements for their ICT, SCRM, and so on. Is there lessons learned from commercial practice that you found can be inculcated into NASA?
So interestingly enough, the team and I, the Association for Supply Chain Management, ASCM, we sat through their class and we found out very quickly that wasn't the same supply chain we were talking about.
Hmm.
So ICT SCRM again is not the same as basic supply chain or supply chain risk management. So whereas we're talking about those threats and vulnerabilities or counterfeit products, they're talking about the bullwhip effect and supply and demand. And so when you try to balance those two different perspectives, you find out quickly that we are at a loss again from that ICT and CSCRM perspective.
Yeah, so pretty much then the government is the best source of wisdom for this particular area for itself, sounds like.
Well, I think it's the collective. It's the collective of both the government and industry. And that public-private partnership through that ICT SCRM task force, I think, is really beneficial in helping bridge that gap, again, between the definitions, the requirements, and some of the knowledge and training that is absolutely needed in this space.
And I did find some presentations of yours online. I think they're still current, but maybe you can help me through this in the lightning round here. Something called the 3Ps of NASA's SCRM program. Is that still extant? And what are the 3Ps?
So the 3Ps are still in effect. They actually got started because just going back a little while. So I went off and I had a baby. I came back and I was offered this opportunity to mature NASA's ICT SCRM program. As a matter of fact, the deputy CIO or associate CIO for privacy and cybersecurity says, "Oh, Kanitra, it'll be like raising two babies." Well, I found out that it was more like raising 17 babies, because not only was it my baby at home and the 11 NASA centers, it was also what I'll call the factions that were inside of some of the centers. Um, so we had to find a way, as we were socializing this new practice, which, I tell people all the time, ICT CSCRM is like Highlander. There can be only one process, and that is the one that is managed by me. So I had to find a way to encourage people to participate. And so we were all at home on furlough, and that's when I decided, oh, I don't need this DVR. I'm going to watch commercials. So the 3 Ps of Colonial Penn with Alex Trebek, and it was just very catchy. So I'm like, how can I translate that to the 3 Ps of NASA SCRM? So we came up with provenance, pedigree, and position, all of which map to those 4 tenets of supply chain that are documented in 800-161. So provenance, of course, we're talking about those blockchains, being able to trust each link before and after in your supply chain. I feel that maps directly to integrity, or is an aspect of integrity for both that supplier and that product. Pedigree, understanding the distribution channels, understanding if it has been in any way compromised from a counterfeit perspective, understanding any vulnerabilities that are inherent to that product, which may or may not have a manufacturer published mitigation. So we feel that tracks directly to those security and quality tenets of 800-161. And then finally, position. NASA builds things to last. The system development life cycle for many of our things have long passed. And what we tend to do when we have finished our scientific discovery, we will turn it over to a university partner, but we continue to maintain it. Again, encouraging that exploration, encouraging that scientific discovery. So that position directly maps to the resilience of that entity. Will they still be around? Will mom and pop still be there? Or do we need to go to Bob in his garage?
And a final question, since you had a child, had a baby, and you are also kind of the owner of NASA's ICT SCRM program, Information and Communications Technology, did you buy a wireless baby monitor?
I did not. And again, so before I took on the ICT SCRM service element lead position, I was the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer for Governance, Risk, and Compliance. Trust no one. So all the wireless and baby monitors, no.
All right.
No, thank you.
Well, I think NASA ICT is in good hands with you. I want to thank you for being with us. Kanitra Tyler is the Supply Chain Risk Management Service Element Lead at NASA. Hey, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
And I'm Tom Temin. You're watching Federal News Network. Let's go back to the studio now for more on the Cyber Leaders Exchange.